This video is about the read and write database operators. These operators use SQL queries to read data from databases into example sets, as well as obviously write example sets out into databases. So we'll cover firstly the differences between version 5 and version 6 of RapidMiner. We'll then look at data sources, and then we'll get on and read something from a database. An important part of that is using parameters to change the query, and you can use macros with that, so we'll look at that briefly. Then we'll get on with writing to a database, and then finally, to illustrate the difference between the SQL issued by the read database operator, you can also use the execute SQL operator just to execute any SQL statement, not to get an example set, but by using it you can see the differences. So let's start with a process. So it's a simple process. Reads the database, writes something to a database. Here's an execute SQL command, which is I'm using actually to read what I've written to the database and put that to a file which I'm then reading here. So the execute SQL and read CSV are really a way of proving that I've written something to a database. And actually it's a read database operator made from two other operators. But the first thing to say is that this is version 5 of RapidMiner. Version 5, the various read database operators are here. There's a big array of them here. If in contrast, version 6, technically they're the same, but there's a licensing restriction. And to turn these red stop signs into green, there's a license you have to buy, and the minimum prices at the moment are January 2014. It's a yearly price of something like $999. Technically it's the same, but obviously the RapidMiner guys want to impose a licensing restriction. So let's start with the read database operator, look at its parameters. So first thing, connection here. Now this is the database that you want to read from, and there are two ways that I used. The JNDI option I don't use. I've never been able to make it work, so we'll focus on predefined and URL. Predefined is we'll get that going first. So basically what you do is you choose a connection, and a connection is shown over here in the tools menu, manage database connections. Mine's at the bottom, it's called web logs. Basically you create a connection, and what you do is you choose one of the databases that has a driver enabled. Here's a list that come essentially by default. I'm going to use PostgreSQL, and you fill in details of the machine where your database is, the port number, the default is 5432 for Postgres, the name of the database scheme, a user, a password, and the URL here gets filled in automatically. Once you've typed these things in, you press the test button and you get a green OK, which is a good thing. Now these database drivers come, as I say, by default with the product, but you can add your own. I won't show you the detail, but you can click on show database drivers to get a list of the drivers, and if I go here, manage database drivers, you can actually add your own. So it's a combination of this dialog box and the previous one, and for completeness, if I just click on this button here, these are locations of the various files that you need to sort out. There's a thing called jdbc properties.xml, different locations depending where you are, and there are jar files corresponding to the drivers. Let's get on and read something. So what you do is, having defined your database connection, it's available in this drop down here. Mine was called web logs. You can actually click this button here if you want to make a new one, and you set to predefined. Now that means the username and password isn't brought out in this box here. We'll do the URL version shortly. You then define a query. You can actually use a query file, in which case you can put your SQL query in a file, or you can restrict it to just retrieving an entire table, But for now, that's too restricting, so I'm just going to use query because it's more flexible. Actually, you can change the query with macros. So I'm basically saying I'm going to go to the weblogs connection using the predefined connection, which has a username and a password in it. Obviously, I'm going to build a query, and if I should click this button here, this is the query. So the connection itself, which is called weblogs, actually what happens is it resolves and works out the names of the database tables. You can see them here, and it will actually, it's quite nice, it actually gives you a way of building your query in real time. It has the effect, of course, of trampling all over the query you had originally. I'm going to cancel that, come back in. So the query I'm going to use is this: select everything from public web transactions where request type is like something and response status is like something else. Okay, so what you're seeing here is a very general query from a single table. You're not restricted to that. You can have an arbitrary query. You can query from views as well. You can basically, I'm selecting everything from the public web transactions table, and I'm restricting it to have a request type and response status. And the question marks are parameters that get filled in. I'll show you how to do that now. You basically go here, edit enumeration, and the order is important. You have to get these in the same order that you want them to be replaced in the query statement previously. So what I'm doing is I'm saying, okay, the first variable is a variable of type varchar. It happens to be, and I'm actually using a macro. I'm doing this here is a macro, so I'm now able to essentially to substitute the value of a macro as the first parameter. If I go back here, build the query again. So what I'm saying is select everything from public web transactions where the request type is like the value of the macro. Now those that know SQL will know that's a string essentially. And then we'll go look at the second one now. Response status equals something. So this is no longer a string. Go back to the edit enumeration button. So now I know the type of the variable is integer, so I'm going to set that to integer. And I've set another macro status. So now the full query is select from public web transactions where request type is like type and response status is like status. So if I show the actual macros, and they're in the context, which I have over here, and then they are. So type and status. Type is %post% and status is 404. So if you know SQL, you know that you have to put percents around things like they're like wildcards. So what we're essentially saying is search for everything. Go back to the query. Search for everything where the request type is like post, or has post somewhere in it, and the response status has 404 as its value. So let's just run that. I'll set a breakpoint on the read database, and you can see post, the request type is post, there it is, and the response status is 404. So it's selected 5 examples corresponding to, there are actually 900 examples in this database. But you can see that in general, very straightforward to issue queries. Now let's change this to be URL. Now what happens is the username and the password now has to be entered, and the actual URL of the database is explicitly filled in here. But it's very similar to the predefined case, it's just there's more data being exposed to the parameters here. I guess this means you could in principle change these using macros or log them perhaps, I don't know. Anyway, there's a bit more flexibility I suppose, but the query is exactly the same. It's the same idea, and by setting that you get the parameters appearing, and sure, it's exactly the same. If I run this again, I'll set a breakpoint. We should get exactly the same answer as before. Sure enough, we do. So now let's clear that breakpoint. Now let's get to the write database operation. So this is somewhat simpler actually. Again, you choose the connection, so I'm predefined, I'll just use weblogs is the same name. Use default schema. If you select that, it makes it a bit easier to write the query, but you can override the default schema with whatever happens to be in the database. There's only one anyway, so it doesn't matter in this case. So I might as well do that. table name, well, I'm going to unilaterally write this to a table called result, and I'm going to use this mode override. You can change that to be override or append depending on what you want to do. I'll just use override to delete it each time. And there are some more advanced parameters. This one perhaps is interesting, where you can generate a primary key. This one is interesting as well for large database writing operations. You can tune that to get that just right. But obviously that's not something I can show you easily in this. So if I run that, I'll set the breakpoint here. What we'll see simply actually the example set of 5 rows, 5 examples. So sure enough, so this has been written to a database, and to prove it, what I've decided to do is show the use of the execute SQL operator. So what I'll do is I'll cancel that breakpoint. Now execute SQL, similar actually, you set up a connection. This time you can create an arbitrary query. I mean, you could create an arbitrary query anyway in the read database operation, but this is much more focused on a single unitary operation, I suppose, which doesn't return an example set. So all I've decided to do is, essentially what I'm doing is selecting everything from the result table I just created. I'm going to write that to a file, as a CSV file actually, and this is the Postgres example you need for that. As it happens, if my SQL is something like that there. I haven't tried it. Okay, so basically that will write to a file, and then I'm going to read CSV here just to prove that the file has things in it that match what I wrote. In passing, you can see the execute SQL also has a parameter possibility, which I'm not using in this case. So if I run that, actually I'll just run the whole process now, and the end result will be an example set which I've read back from the result file that I've written explicitly as part of this execute SQL statement. So I'll run it now. Sure enough, there is a CSV file output, and it looks very similar. There's some subtle differences in this case. You can see these quotes have been doubled up, but that's just a sort of a local detail to be fixed. But anyway, the point being here that I've written something to the database, read it back into a file, and read the file, and the fact that the two are basically the same means I successfully wrote to the database, as if you didn't believe me. Okay, so finally then, let's just go back to I think the hardest thing I find with this whole setup is actually these parameters here. So what I'll do is I'll just cycle through the query and the enumeration for the parameters so you can see how it's done, because that can be fiddly. So I'll show that finally.